Here to the office of the Prime Minister of Canada, the land called Canada, which is on unceded, unsurrendered, traditional Algonquin territory. And we're here today with a very simple message. Last week in Washington, D.C., Foreign Affairs Minister Christopher Freeland spoke about the importance of an international rules-based order that would respect international law. And it's kind of rare for us to completely agree with Christopher Freeland, but on that point we agree. But we'd like to take it one point further and say it's not good enough just to call for respect for international law. You actually have to comply with international law. So today we are going to be presenting the Prime Minister with a key part of that international law. It is the 1984 Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And if you read this, and if Justin Trudeau and Christopher Freeland read this, they will immediately cancel all deportation to torture proceedings against Mohamed Harkat, and they will not initiate deportation to torture hearings against Mohamed Majoub. These secret trials have been going on for decades in this country. They must be brought to an end. Someone who is very familiar with this convention, as well as something called the optional protocol to this convention, is the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, who's very familiar with these cases. Please welcome Alex Neve.
Thanks, Matthew. Good to be with you, Sophie, and excellent to see this turnout. Obviously reflects the fact that there continues to be deep, very serious concern about the injustices that Mohamed Harkat has endured for so long now. And I just did a tally, friends. Do you know that it has been 5,677 days of injustice for Mohamed Harkat? That takes us back to when he was first arrested under the Immigration Security Certificate back in 2002 that unleashed this Kafkaesque, unending nightmare of injustice and deep worry and anguish in particular about facing the prospect of torture in Algeria. And as we all know, there are so many serious human rights concerns in Mohamed Harkat's case and all of the Immigration Security Certificate cases against which you have been struggling, we have been struggling, Mo and Sophie have been struggling for so long now. But we're gathered today, June 25th, on the eve of an important International Day of Solidarity with victims and survivors of torture around the world. This is a United Nations Day of Solidarity. That's tomorrow. We're here on the eve of that day because of the very serious concern that has always been front and center in Mohamed Harkat's case, and that is the cavalier, callous willingness of the Canadian government to steam ahead with this case on the basis of secretive, unfair proceedings for 5,677 days now, despite the fact that at the end of it, what awaits Mohamed is return to torture in Algeria. That is illegal under international law, as we are reminding Prime Minister Trudeau by dropping off, very conveniently, this copy of the relevant United Nations Convention today. It is also illegal under Canadian law. Yet for 5,677 days, that's what Mohamed and Sophie have had to struggle against and clamor for justice in the face of that very serious risk. We're in front of Prime Minister Trudeau's office in particular because he's the one now who needs to live up to the promises, the very fine words we have heard from him and other members of his government several times now about how Canada does stand strong against torture, how Canada does stand with the survivors and victims of torture. Well, if that's the case, how can it be that 5,677 days later, we need to gather here one more time? There have been not one, not two, not three, but now 4 prime ministers who have had it in their hands to do the right thing, to cancel this deportation and ensure that Mohamed Harkat's nightmare of human rights violations and injustice and deep fear about return to torture will finally come to an end. It has to end here. Prime Minister Trudeau, we're gathering because we look to you for the leadership, for the principled commitment that you have put in front of the international community so many times, that Canada will absolutely, unconditionally always stand against torture. Here's your opportunity to demonstrate, and here's your opportunity to ensure that it's not going to be 5,678, 5,679, 5,680 days of injustice and risk of torture. It needs to end now. Thanks for being here today, friends.
Thank you, Alex. And while Alex is here, I'd like to ask him a question, because Alex, you've traveled around the world with Amnesty International, and you've gone to countries where torture is rampant. When you share what's happening in Canada, what is the reaction of people around the world when they say, really, Canada's doing this?
Well, I think there's great disbelief that Canada, which does obviously have a strong reputation on the world stage as a country that believes in the entirety of the international human rights commitments that we've signed on to, would be willing to turn away from those commitments and not take a strong stand when we've got a concrete opportunity to demonstrate we really mean it. Those concrete opportunities arise when you have an individual case, when you're making decisions about the fate of a real person, not just making fine speeches and espousing great principles. And now is the time for us to demonstrate that.
May I ask a follow-up as a journalist here? As you travel around the world and you see the example that Canada sets by deporting or trying to deport someone like Mohamed Harkat to torture, what excuse does that give other nations with respect to their own policies on torture?
There are so many reasons why we have to do the right thing in Mohamed Harkat's case. Obviously, first and foremost, we have to do the right thing because it's his right. We need to provide him with the justice and safety that is his due. But we also need to do the right thing because Canada's voice on the world stage as a champion against torture, as a country that's going to be at the forefront of the struggle against torture, needs to be as strong as it possibly can be. And our voice will only be strong if we demonstrate that unequivocally, wherever and whenever we have the opportunity, we make the right decisions, we take the right stand, and that's always standing with victims, it's always standing with individuals who do face a risk of torture, and that's what we have not done for 5,677 days, and it needs to stop now.
Thank you so much, Alex Neve from Amnesty International. Our next speaker is another longtime human rights campaigner who is also the newly elected member of the provincial parliament, who no doubt will have his hands full dealing with domestic human rights issues with the new government here in Ontario. We are very proud that Joel Harden has joined us this morning. Joel has been on many of these pickets for people like Mohamed Harkat, for people like Hassan Diab, for all those who have been treated as less than human in the so-called war on terror. Please welcome your new MPP, Joel Harden.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the Algonquin people for the opportunity to be here on their territory today. I want to just say a few things and then pass the mic on to the next person who will continue to inspire this community. A second ago, Matthew mentioned Hassan Diab's name. And yesterday, I had the good fortune to be on traditional Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Algonquin territory in what we call Kingston, because the riding associations of my party were meeting to debrief the Ontario election. And there was a community festival going on at the same time, if you know Kingston, in Skeleton Park. It's a very good, vibrant arts festival. And who did I meet there but Hassan Diab? Hassan Diab, Rania, and family. And what I'm reminded of, standing next to this incredibly strong person here, and thinking about Sophie and Mo, and when I talked to Rania and Hassan yesterday in Kingston, I remember where change comes from. Change comes from right here, right on this street corner. And sometimes when we're in the thick of such incredible, frustrating political circumstances, it's hard to remember that, right? But I want everybody who took time today to think about why Chrystia Freeland made the right move. Made the right move for Rania, for Hassan, for all the people who fought to make sure that he was brought back to Canada. That he was no longer separated from his family, his children. And that was something that happened because people in this city care. People in the surrounding community care. And when I think about Sophie and Mo, and the first time I met Mo at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center on Innes Road a number of years ago, and had the opportunity to just drink in some of his humanity in the face of terrible, you know, the OCDC, and you know the way things work there. I mean, we have a problem in our criminal justice system, particularly for Muslim men who are disproportionately criminalized, disproportionately subject to a different justice system. And there are people in high places in this country right now who can stop this, or who can start standing against the legacy of this. And I'm very honored to be with the campaigners here who are presenting these documents to our Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's staff. And I want to believe in my heart, I'm sorry if it sounds naive, but I want to believe in my heart that when these issues are constantly raised by people like you who care, that we can start moving open some of these doors. And I understand how if you get elected and you inherit the residue of colonialism and racism for decades, how it's not always easy. But we have seen in recent months and years that you can help Hassan Diab come home to his family. And you can end the ordeal that Sophie and Mo have had to put up with, right? It can happen. It can also happen for the St. Anne residential school survivors. It can happen for so many others. But I just want to remind us and end on this note. The only reason we're having this conversation is because of Sophie, because of Mo, and because of us. So I know it's summertime, but I want to acknowledge the fact that all of us are still plugged in, that this community does care. And I want to believe that people in this building and that building and all of these buildings, the Justice Canada building down the road, that they have hearts too. So this matters. Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister Freeland, stop this deportation, stand up against a legacy of intolerance, and announce that this space, this traditional space of the Algonquin people, which was about friendship from the beginning, or was supposed to be, that we stand for something better. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Let's keep going. Let's keep supporting Sophie and Mo. Let's do this.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you for that very important reminder as well. There was a report that came out today that said 46% of young people now in Canadian prisons are Indigenous. 46%. And part of that is a legacy of the very first acts of renditions to torture which took place on this land called Canada under the guise of something called the residential school system, designed in part by the man for whom this building was very recently named, Mr. Langevin. In those residential schools, there were electric chairs. There were other forms of torture, psychological torture, sleep deprivation, temperature controls, all kinds of tortures taking place. And thank you for mentioning St. Anne's Residential School, because this is a government that continues to fight the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School as well. I'd like to now introduce two women who have been leaders in this struggle since the very beginning, who know Mo and Sophie very closely and are still here today. Jo Wood and Ria Hanen, if you can come forward and say a few words about why you're here and what you know about these individuals.
I first got involved with Mo when I went to visit him at the detention center because of the work that Sophie had been doing on his behalf. Of course, a terrible place. There wasn't an angry bone in his body. He was just trying to make me feel not awkward in that horrible place. And I thought, there's something wrong here. So I have been part of the support team for all these years. But more than that, I consider them to be personal friends. We've eaten meals with them, both in my house and their house and other people's houses. Mo comes over to help me with all kinds of repairs on my house. He is a zero risk in Canada. Zero, zero, zero risk. Why would we ever even think about sending him away to torture? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, I'm part of a faith community, and we have the privilege that dear Mo works for our faith community. And it was wonderful when he was finally hired in our community, that when I came in the office, and one of the office staff came to me and gave me a big hug, and they said, "Will you believe it? We just saw Mo and we hired him and we love him." That was the first encounter they had. And as Joe said, we immediately felt this is a man of honor, a man who respects people, a man who has great, great compassion. But I also wanted to add something that you, Mr. Neve, said. There is fear in Hassan's heart. And every time, because I see Hassan, sorry, I mix the two. Whenever I see Mo, he will say, you know, he's afraid. He's afraid. And we can tell him what we want. This government will never, never deport you. But deep in Mo's heart, there is that immense fear. And only our government can take that away. And I hope that that will happen now. Thank you.
Right on, Rita. Thank you. Next up, I'm going to invite someone who is very active not only on Mo's case and Dr. Diab's case, but all the cases. Last week, there was an Auditor General's report that came out that said Canadian officials are not responding properly when Canadians are being detained abroad and being tortured. Do you know that if you are being tortured abroad, it can take Chrystia Freeland up to 6 months to figure it out? Up to 6 months. All of the lessons of the Aurora case, of the Yakabuchi inquiry, the case of Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Mahdi, Muyad Nuruddin, these are inquiries that happened well over a decade ago, and still Foreign Affairs is not doing its job when it comes to representing the interests of those who are being mistreated overseas. Anyhow, someone who is very familiar with those issues as well as Mo's case, Tim McSorley.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks so much to everyone for being here today. It's great to see so many people, but it's sad that we have to be here again. It's sad that once again we are outside the Prime Minister's office, once again demanding, after 15 years, that Mohamed Harkat, that Mo, not be deported to torture. It is shameful. The ICLMG came together in 2002. We're a coalition of 45 organizations, and we saw the writing on the wall that these types of security laws are used against certain communities, that they are driven by fear, that they can be misused in ways that target Muslim men, Muslim women, people of color, indigenous peoples across this country, and that is what we have seen for 15 years. And it's gone parallel to Mo's case of seeing that year after year, despite the government's own agencies, despite the courts, despite psychiatrists finding that Mo and people in his community, all of us here, that he poses no risk to Canada, that he still continues to face Mohamed Harkat from being deported to torture, and he hasn't refused, he hasn't responded to those calls. And so today, on top of Chrystia Freeland, on top of Prime Minister Trudeau, we need to call on Ralph Goodale to take action and make sure that Mo Harkat is not deported to torture. Matthew mentioned it, others have mentioned it, thank you. Others have mentioned it, that this is parallel to other actions that Canadian government continues to take that undermines the spoken words that Justin Trudeau made, that Canada should never be complicit in torture. There are continue to be directives on the books that allow the Canadian government to share information with regimes that we know commit mistreatment and torture. Recently, the review body for CSIS came out and said that they still, despite these ministerial directives, do not have guidelines in place to make sure that they're not sharing information with regimes that engage in mistreatment and torture. This is what led to the torture of Maher Arar. This has led to the torture of other Canadians abroad. And this, we are highly concerned that if Mohamed Harkat is deported to Algeria, that information from our own security agencies would continue to be shared and place Mo and other people at risk. And we can't let this stand. So I want to thank everyone for being out here today and continue to raise your voices against torture in all its forms, and against the continued use of these laws to target people like Mo and Muslim men, especially across Canada, and that we can't allow this to go for another day. Thank you very much.
Right on, Tim. Thank you. Last October, Justin Trudeau said the following, quote, "I hope people remember to demand of governments, this one and all future governments, that nobody ever has their fundamental rights violated either through inaction or deliberate action by Canadian governments. Nobody ever deserves to be tortured. And when a Canadian government is either complicit in that or was not active enough in preventing it, there needs to be a responsibility taken." So he has called on us to call on him to take that responsibility. And the person who's going to deliver that message directly to him right now is Sophie Harkat. I first met Sophie Harkat on the phone on the evening of December the 10th, 2002, International Human Rights Day. I called her up. I said, "I hear your husband's been arrested on a secret trial security certificate." And she says, "What the hell's going on and who are you?" And I said, "Well, I work with other people who are in similar situations." She says, "You mean other people are going through the nightmare I am?" And we've been together ever since. So please welcome my security certificate buddy, Sophie Harkat.
I would like to thank everyone for coming out today. First, I would like to apologize. Mo's not here because he's trying to be a good citizen and he's at work today. Thank you to Alex, to Tim, to Anne, to Matthew, to Joel, to everybody here who has been coming to these rallies for almost 16 years now. 16 years. This government is the government that signed the certificate against Mohamed, and they're the same government who have the power to stop this. For 16 years, we've been going through torture, psychological torture, and living with a cloud of deportation. But I have to say that the last couple of weeks, CBSA has been harassing us since our last bail review. And for us, it is nonstop psychological torture. And Mo needs to stay here where he has a family, where he is loved. He's loved by his community, by his supporters, by his friends. And they can just put an end to this. The minister has had our file for over a year and a half, and he can just sign a paper to end this and just do the right thing. We want to move on with our lives. Mo was never a threat, is not a threat, will never be a threat. He has a clear criminal record. He passed his criminal background check before I did. I had to get fingerprinted. They have nothing against him. We are here because the original evidence was destroyed against Mo, and the majority of the allegations are based on an informant that failed his lie detector test, and his credibility was never tested. It will always be the government's word versus Mo's word. We cannot win. Just do the right thing, please, and just end this right there so we can move on with our lives. That's all we're asking for. And thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for attending all our rallies and for being so supportive. And this is one reason why we've kept going all these years, because all of you are around, and we feel the love and we feel the support. Thank you very much.
So what's going to happen now is Sophie has written a personal letter to Mr. Trudeau. Can you show us what you're going to put into there, Sophie? What's that? So this is the Convention Against Torture, and we're urging Prime Minister Trudeau, it's not very long. You could even read it in one sitting on the toilet if you needed to, but nonetheless, find the time to read this thing. Don't flush it down the toilet. Put it on your office wall, because you need to respect international law and, as Alex pointed out, Canadian law. The law under which Mo is slated to be deported to torture, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, George Orwell would be pleased, actually has a section in there saying this act must be read not with respect to, but in compliance with international law. And this is international law with which the government must be in compliance. So we're now going to head over to Metcalfe Street, and we're going to deliver this personally and hope that Mr. Trudeau reads this document and releases Mo and Sophie from this ongoing limbo, this ongoing torture of the threat of torture, and that he end the secret trial security certificate regime once and for all. So thank you again for being here, and we're all going to gather now. Sophie, if you want to lead the way, and let's go drop this thing off at the Metcalfe entrance. You just
Je peux pas, c'est où?
En descendant, c'est la poste.
OK. Mais ma mère, elle va rester avec le système de son.
Surveiller le speaker.
OK. Le monde est de scène.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Good morning, Anne.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Waiting a long time. Oh, he does. Yeah, I'm sure it's all related to
I try and
this.
run a good ship here, okay?
Yeah, we're just the way that we're going to hopefully try to.
We're getting ready to celebrate Christmas.
And there was no police today. It just shows how much Trump he is.
Yeah.
I'm surprised because the DF event last night was full of police officers.
Yeah. Hello. This one right there.
Sophie, it's been 16 years. 16 years you've been having to do this. You getting tired?
I'm very tired.
Yeah, it's kind of cruel that the government would not give you a response one way or the other, isn't
Yeah,
it?
that's the worst part is the waiting. The waiting is the worst part.
Yeah. And people who are actually imprisoned and being tortured actually say sometimes it's the anticipation of what might come next,
Right.
which is actually worse. It's psychological torture.
Yeah.
No.
He's starting to know you, right?
So here we are at the delivery entrance to the Prime Minister's office. I'm just going to turn this over to Sophie. And Sophie, can you just introduce yourself? And Don in there, he's going to be able to hear you. And you just explain exactly why you're here.
I'll hold that up for you.
We're here to deliver a very important piece of mail, which is the Convention Against Torture, because my husband is facing deportation to torture, and we would like to tell the Prime Minister to put an end to this. Put an end to it. Please make sure he gets it, because if he doesn't get it, we'll keep putting the pressures on. Thank you.
And as was pointed out earlier, this is international law that is binding on Canada. It is incorporated into the Canadian Criminal Code. It is incorporated into the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And so by trying to deport Mohamed Harkat to torture, we are, as a nation, as a government, in violation of the Convention Against Torture. So once again, the message is very clear. Mr. Trudeau has called on us to call on him when his government or any other government is violating the law. They are now violating the law. They've been violating the law under this regime, in Mo's case, since International Human Rights Day, December the 10th, 2002. Over 5,400 days of living behind prison walls, of living in solitary confinement, of living under the most draconian house arrest bail conditions in Canadian history, which continue to harass Sophie and Mo to this very day. Sophie, do you want to put this together, and we'll deliver that to the Prime Minister?
Yeah, just put that in, seal it. Okay, and just give it to Don there.
Sophie is now just about to deliver the Convention Against Torture to Mr. Trudeau. We are calling on Mr. Trudeau to read this convention and to comply with this convention, as well as all of the other international and domestic laws that are being violated with the ongoing Canadian complicity in torture. We want to thank everyone for coming out today. Look at that sign back there. It says unjust and unconstitutional. That is the security certificate regime. Let's look at that banner that says stop secret trials in Canada. Look at the banner that says Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice. Thank you all for being here. Heck no! Mo can't go! 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 When you get home today, can you please call the Prime Minister's office? The number is on the website of the Office of the Prime Minister, and leave a message there saying, I was here today. I demand that you read this convention and that you comply with this convention and drop the deportation against Mohamed Harkat. Further, we ask you to direct your public safety minister, Ralph Goodale, to act on an application which has been on his desk for 2 years to land him as a permanent resident of Canada. Enough with the psychological torture, enough with the limbo. Call him, email him, and when you see this on Facebook, share it with your friends and encourage them to do the same. This government has to be pushed. Mr. Trudeau himself has acknowledged he needs to be pushed. We're just being friendly Canadians and trying to push him along to comply with Canadian and international law. So thank you again to Alex Neve, to Tim McSorley, to Anne Dagenet, who is here filming today, to Joe, to Rhea, to Joel, everyone who has spoken, and all of us who have been walking this walk for the last 16 years. Let's make this the final year that this has to take place for the Harkats. Let them get on with a normal life. Thank you again for coming.